She thought the mic was off. In a room full of power suits, blinking cameras, and carefully rehearsed outrage, one sentence slipped through the cracks. A single muttered phrase. "They're leeches." Not shouted, not scripted, just whispered, like a truth too ugly to admit out loud. But the mic was still on, and one woman was listening. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood to speak days later, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She didn't need to. She just pressed play. What followed wasn't politics. It was a reckoning. This is the story of what happens when silence betrays intent, and when one voice dares to turn a whisper into a mirror. It's a dramatization inspired by the tensions we live with every day, where fact meets feeling and fiction reveals a deeper truth. Because while this story is fictional, the emotions it stirs, the fear, the fury, the hope, are real. And sometimes all it takes is one mic left on for a nation to finally hear what was never meant to be spoken. The air inside the Rayburn building was colder than usual. Not from the DC weather. It was the kind of chill that came from tension too thick to cut, only to breathe in. AOC arrived 15 minutes early, coat still on, black notebook pressed to her side like armor. She didn't need caffeine this morning. Something told her the room would provide enough of a jolt. As she approached the Judiciary Committee chamber, she noticed the hallway unusually quiet. Not silent, quiet in that uneasy, murmuring way people get when something's about to go wrong, and no one wants to say it out loud. Her aide, Luis, caught up to her with brisk footsteps. "MTG's on fire today," he said under his breath, eyes scanning the committee agenda like it might combust. "She's been ranting in the back corridor since sunrise. Brace yourself." AOC didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the doors ahead, where behind polished wood and gold-lettered plaques, a country's values would once again be placed on the stand, thinly veiled as policy debate. She exhaled. They always talk loudest before they fall apart. The chamber doors opened. Inside, the air was thick with formalities. Suits filed into their seats like chess pieces taking position. Someone handed out printed statements. A few reporters sat quietly behind the glass. At first glance, it looked like any other Tuesday hearing. Stacks of paper, monotone introductions, the slow erosion of public faith wearing a tie. But AOC had learned to read the temperature of a room without touching a thermostat. Something was off. Too polished, too choreographed. Like everyone already knew a scene was about to play out. They just hadn't decided who would blink first. She slid into her seat, second row, 4 seats left of the chairwoman. MTG sat across the aisle, tapping a pen against her folder in a syncopated rhythm that seemed designed to irritate. Her eyes darted around the room like she was waiting for someone to challenge her, or applaud. Louis leaned down beside AOC, speaking low. Word is she's prepping a speech to hammer the border policies, but not the bill. She's going personal. Targets, not arguments. AOC kept her eyes forward. Let her try. One of the aides passed by and set down a stack of documents in front of each member. AOC flipped hers open. Line items on asylum access, border processing reform, community reinvestment funding. Dry language. But the real battle was never in the wording. It was in the way people twisted it to fit their agenda. And lately, some members had made cruelty a performance art. She took out her pen, underlined 2 phrases in the bill, and circled a third. Expedited removal procedures. That phrase, she knew, could mean a mother losing her child before breakfast. The chairwoman called the room to order. As names were read aloud and gavel strikes echoed, AOC scanned the room. No one looked up. They were all eyes down, mouths closed, minds rehearsing, except MTG. She leaned back in her chair like she owned the walls, smirking faintly, and then, just for a moment, locked eyes with AOC. It was brief, but charged, not a greeting, not even a threat. Just a look that said, "I came to make noise." "What did you come for?" AOC blinked once, slow, then turned back to her folder. She didn't need to reply. Not yet. Because something told her this wasn't going to be just another hearing. Something beneath the formality hummed, like a wire fraying in a wall no one wanted to open. And while the cameras focused on scripted outrage and rehearsed barbs, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat silent, still, and ready. Because when the mic is always on, the most dangerous thing you can do is assume it isn't. The room shifted when Marjorie Taylor Greene stood to speak, not physically but in energy, in temperature, like someone had yanked the conversation off course and pointed it toward a storm. She didn't ease into her remarks. She launched. "This isn't about compassion. This is about control," she barked, her voice sharp enough to rattle the glass behind the gallery. "Our border is not just broken. It's being deliberately dismantled by people who put foreign lives before American ones." A few heads nodded around her. Others barely looked up. Most had heard some version of this speech before. But today, Greene came in hotter than usual. She threw around phrases like illegal infiltration and engineered chaos, accusing the administration of flooding our neighborhoods with undocumented criminals. She made a point to use the word invasion 3 times in the span of one paragraph. It wasn't a policy critique. It was a performance. And it wasn't meant to persuade. It was meant to provoke. AOC sat still, eyes locked on the printed copy of the bill in front of her, pen gently tapping her lower lip. She didn't interrupt. She didn't sigh. Not even an eye roll. But inside, something was hardening. Something quiet and deliberate. She had been in enough of these hearings to know when someone wasn't just grandstanding, but trying to turn the hearing itself into a weapon. Greene closed her remarks with a line that landed like a punch. "You can't build a strong country by letting it be looted from the inside." And just like that, she sat down, grabbing the microphone base with a sharp twist, but not enough to mute it. Her light stayed red. The signal was still live. She leaned sideways to her staffer, a man in a navy suit with a plastic badge and anxious smile. Thinking she was off mic, Greene lowered her voice just slightly, just enough to signal secrecy without knowing that secrecy had already fled the room. "Why don't we just ship them back on buses?" she muttered dryly. "They're leeches anyway." The phrase floated out, not loudly but clearly, like static that slices through silence. It wasn't screamed. It didn't need to be. The weight of it came not from volume, but from familiarity, like a truth she had said before, like something that lived comfortably in her private vocabulary. AOC didn't move at first. She blinked. Then she stopped tapping her pen. Her eyes didn't go to Greene. They went to the mic, the red light, still on. She felt it like a pulse, a thrum in her chest, a moment that came and passed so quickly that most would miss it. But she had trained herself to notice these things. The mistake, the slip, the silence that reveals more than 1,000 shouts. Across the aisle, one of the interns stiffened. A reporter behind the glass narrowed her eyes, unsure if she'd heard it right. But AOC heard it, every word, every syllable. And not just as a congresswoman, but as a daughter of immigrants, as someone who had watched people be dehumanized with cleaner words, softer tones, better disguises. This wasn't just an insult, it was a reveal. She looked back down at her folder. Slowly, with deliberate calm, she circled one line of the testimony. "Humane border reform begins with seeing people as people." Then she wrote one word next to it. Small, all caps, record. The meeting continued. Other voices took the mic, but the static was still in the air. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, silent, sharp, and suddenly certain, knew this hearing had just shifted. Not in votes, not in rhetoric, but in truth. The kind you can't bury once it's spoken, especially when the mic never went off. AOC didn't shift in her seat. She didn't stiffen or frown or narrow her eyes the way a politician might when offered a moment of a theatrical outrage. She simply glanced, first at Greene, who was now smirking to her staffer like nothing had happened, then at the mic base on the desk just below her. The light, still on, bright, unblinking, and red as the tip of a lit match. She let her gaze linger on it for a second longer, just long enough to let the moment settle into her memory. That particular shade of red would be hard to forget, not for its color, but for what it meant. In this room, on this day, it meant that the truth had accidentally told on itself, and that almost no one noticed. Almost. She shifted her pen gently to the side, then opened to a clean page of her notebook. On the top line, in neat, steady handwriting, She wrote just one word in all capital letters. Record. No exclamation mark. No underlining, just the word itself. Calm, cold, controlled. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with this. Not because she was afraid, not even because of politics, but because moments like this demanded more than reaction. They demanded strategy, precision, restraint, even when every cell in your body screamed for exposure. Too many people had gotten comfortable in this room, comfortable assuming that the ugliest parts of what they believed would always stay backstage, that the lights would always be off when they whispered, that microphones were props and never witnesses. She knew better. And yet, as she looked around the chamber, it became clear that almost everyone else had moved on. One member was checking his phone beneath the desk. Another whispered something about lunch. The hearing hadn't even paused. That's what startled her most. Not what was said, but how effortlessly it had passed. It made her think of her father again, of the days growing up in the Bronx when he would sit with her during the news and pause at moments that didn't seem important to anyone else. "Did you catch that?" he'd say, even if she hadn't. That's when the truth got lazy and let itself out. This was that moment. AOC looked back at Green, not with anger, but with something colder. Focus. Green didn't notice. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She was already scribbling notes on a legal pad, probably drafting her next rhetorical jab or tweet storm for later that evening. Her confidence wasn't even smug. It was routine. AOC turned her eyes away. She didn't need to lock into a standoff. Not yet. The power wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the knowledge that something real had just been said. Something raw, something too honest to spin. That's what made it dangerous. That's what made it useful. Truth, she knew, was like water behind a dam. It could stay hidden for a while. But when it leaked, even through something as small as a live mic left on, the pressure began to build. And if timed right, it didn't need to be forced open. It would burst. So she kept writing. Just a few more notes, nothing obvious. Her tone steady, her posture relaxed. Anyone watching would have thought she was simply taking comments for the record. But the truth was, she was holding something far more fragile than paper. A moment of exposure not meant for the world. A mistake of arrogance. And in the right hands, a mistake that could echo. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. She didn't strike. She prepared. Because she knew, when someone believes no one's listening, that's when they reveal who they really are. And that red light, it was still on. The hallway outside the chamber had the quiet hum of political digestion, staffers murmuring in low tones, elevator doors sliding shut, the faint clack of heels against marble. No one was shouting. No one was celebrating. The hearing had ended the way most of them did, with vague conclusions and clipped goodbyes. But Alexandria felt a different kind of weight settle over her shoulders as she walked back to her office, her notebook pressed against her side, her thoughts moving faster than her steps. Luis was already ahead of her, badge flashing as he swiped into their small third-floor suite. Inside, the room smelled faintly of printer toner and cold coffee. Comforting, familiar. But even before she spoke, the staffers inside looked up. They had all felt it. That ripple. AOC closed the door gently behind her. No press, no outside voices. Just her inner circle. The people who didn't need headlines to tell them when something real had happened. She didn't sit right away. She just asked, "Did anyone else hear it?" There was a pause, then Luis spoke. "Yeah, I did. Clear as day. Mike was definitely hot." Sasha, their communications lead, pulled up the committee's public feed on a second monitor. It might have been scrubbed from the live caption, but if we pull the raw committee archive, give me a second. Everyone watched her fingers move quickly across the keyboard. The tension in the room was quiet, not frantic. It was the tension of professionals who knew they were staring at a match in dry kindling and deciding whether to light it. The screen flickered. Time code cued. Audio played. And there it was. "Why don't we just ship them back on buses? They're leeches anyway." The room fell into a long silence. Not from disbelief, but confirmation. It wasn't garbled. It wasn't taken out of context. It was crisp, the kind of clarity that even denial couldn't fog. AOC folded her arms slowly. She didn't even lower her voice that much. Luis looked around the room. We caught it. But if we heard it, others could have too. It might already be floating out there. Sasha leaned back in her chair. Or no one noticed. The live feed's been quiet. I checked Twitter. So far, nothing. Not a blip. Everyone's just quoting her scripted stuff about the border. The usual fire and brimstone. AOC finally sat down, the weight of her coat still on her shoulders, as if she didn't want to get too comfortable. She tapped her pen against her palm once, then again. We need to decide, she said calmly. Do we wait, or do we leak? Silence again, but not the stunned kind. This was tactical silence. Lewis offered the first thought. If we leak it now, it looks like a gotcha moment. Politically effective, sure, but it could backfire. They'll claim we planted it, took it out of context, you know how they spin. Sasha nodded. But if we wait too long, it loses oxygen. The country forgets quickly, especially with her. She says things like this so often, it almost desensitizes people. AOC rested her hand on her notebook. She hadn't written anything new on the page since the hearing. Just that one word, record. Still sitting at the top like a headline waiting for its story. I'm not interested in the stunt, she said. If we act, it has to be deliberate. It has to remind people what's behind the rhetoric, not just what it sounds like. There was a beat, then she added almost to herself. She thought no one was listening. That's the part I can't get past. The staff sat with that for a moment. Not just the words, but the implications. The possibility that this wasn't a one-off, or even a misstep. It was a glimpse, a window left cracked open. And the question now was simple, but heavy. Do they close it quietly, or open it wide and let the country look in? By the time dusk rolled over the Capitol dome, most of the staffers had cleared out. The office lights down the hallway clicked off one by one, leaving AOC's suite glowing like a lone window in a quiet neighborhood. She sat at her desk, the audio clip still playing faintly in her mind, looping not just the words but the tone. Not angry, not accidental. Casual, like someone commenting on the weather. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months but thought about often. Representative Evelyn Harmon, retired, revered, and still sharp enough to cut through any political fog with one sentence. Harmon had served 7 terms and walked away on her own terms, refusing to water down her final year with performative legacy speeches. Alexandria had admired that. Still did. The line rang once, twice. Then came the voice. Warm, steady. I figured I'd hear from you again, baby. AOC exhaled and smiled. Hi, Congresswoman. I hope I'm not calling too late. Chilly, I'm retired. I eat dinner at 5 and gossip with God by 7. You're just in time. That made her laugh, briefly, but the weight returned quickly. Something happened today. On the floor, MTG left her mic on. She leaned over to her aide and said, AOC paused, not because she was unsure, but because saying it out loud made it heavier. She called immigrants leeches, said we should ship them back. The line went quiet but not empty, a kind of listening silence, the kind only elders know how to hold. And you heard it? Clear. So did a few others on my team. The feed caught it. We have it on record. Another pause. So what's the question? Evelyn finally asked. Do I confront her now? Put it out there. Let the public hear it raw. Not yet. That answer came so quickly it almost startled AOC. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk. Why not? Because truth is strongest when it waits its moment, Harmon said gently. Right now it's just audio. If you push too fast, you'll let them turn the conversation into whether you were spying or ambushing or making something out of nothing. You'll be defending how you found it instead of forcing them to reckon with what she said. But if I wait, won't that make it look like I'm calculating? Baby, politics is calculation. So is justice. You ever see a dam break? Doesn't start with the flood. It starts with a trickle, a pressure point. You've got that now. Don't waste it yelling at the wall. Wait until the wall has no choice but to crack. AOC was quiet. She ran her fingers slowly over the edge of her notebook, tracing the word record without looking at it. You ever feel like the more hateful something is, the more careful you have to be exposing it? She asked. Evelyn chuckled softly. That's because hate expects to be loud. But truth don't shout, it hums. And if you time it right, it'll make people stop in their tracks. Alexandria nodded slowly, even though the woman couldn't see her. When you strike, let it be with purpose, Evelyn continued. Not for drama, for memory. Say it so they don't forget it next week. Say it so they remember who they almost let speak unchecked. Thank you, AOC said quietly. Don't thank me. Just do it right. When the call ended, the room felt heavier but clearer, like the kind of stillness before a shift. She didn't need to react. Not yet. She needed to prepare. Because when truth arrives at the right time, it doesn't knock. It resounds. The office had thinned out, but AOC stayed behind. The city outside the window was softening into twilight, headlights blinking on like fireflies beneath a steel sky. Inside, only the buzz of her laptop and the occasional hum of the HVAC system broke the silence. The clip was open on her screen, time-stamped, raw, and untouched. She leaned forward, headphones on, notebook nearby, prepared to listen not just for the headline, but for what it revealed beneath. She played it again, this time from 5 minutes before the infamous line. Another teary immigrant story. These people always know how to cry on cue. The voice was unmistakable. Green's off mic, but fully audible. Dismissive, practiced, like someone who'd said it many times before, but usually out of reach of microphones. Then just 2 minutes later, a witness began speaking. The woman's accent was thick, Caribbean maybe, English laced with rhythm, the kind that carried entire histories in its cadence. As she explained her journey, Green turned to her staffer again, this time chuckling under her breath. God, if I had to listen to that voice every day, I'd cross a border too. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it was there, captured, preserved. AOC paused the audio. Her stomach clenched, not in shock, but in recognition. It wasn't just the content, it was the casualness, the way the cruelty landed like punctuation, not a punchline. Green wasn't slipping up, she was slipping out, showing the part of herself she usually kept just beneath the surface, like mold behind a fresh coat of paint. Alexandria sat back, letting the silence in the room fill her ears now. For a moment, she wasn't a congresswoman. She wasn't a headline or a hashtag. She was just a daughter of a father who had come to this country believing that if you worked hard, if you spoke clearly, if you stood with your back straight and your voice steady, they would see you. They would hear you. She could hear his voice again, not in the past tense, but as if he were seated across from her now, in the cracked vinyl chair he used to read in. If they don't want you here, he would say, eyes soft but unwavering, then speak so they can't ignore you. And she had. But the truth was, even now, after all the speeches, the hearings, the interviews, there were still rooms where her voice was tolerated but not welcomed, where her presence was measured not by her arguments, but by how many feathers she ruffled just by walking in. And yet this wasn't about her. It was about that woman on the witness stand, telling her story with shaking hands and an accent Green thought was worth mocking. It was about all the times someone like her was brushed off, not because her words weren't true, but because her voice didn't sound American enough. AOC took off the headphones. Her hand hovered over the notebook again. This time she wrote more than one word. She scribbled timestamps, jotted quotes, circled phrases. Then at the bottom of the page she wrote, "This isn't about a mic. This is about a mask." Because what the mic had caught wasn't a gaffe. It was a glimpse, a fragment of truth spoken when the speaker believed no one was listening. And if Green had grown careless enough to let this much slip, Alexandria couldn't help but wonder. What else was waiting beneath the surface? Just one red light away from revelation. The clip was less than 3 minutes long, but it had already been chopped, captioned, and shared thousands of times by breakfast. MTG's voice rang out across phones and tablets like a battle cry for a very specific America, the kind that only clapped when they saw someone get put in their place, preferably someone poor, brown, or foreign. The chyron beneath her read, "Marjorie Taylor Greene takes aim at border hypocrisy." But it wasn't hypocrisy she was attacking. It was humanity. These radicals care more about illegals than they do about Americans, Green said with that tight smile she reserved for TV. They hand out sympathy like Halloween candy, but where is the compassion for the American working class? For the mothers who lost their kids to fentanyl? For the veterans living on the streets? For our citizens left behind? The host nodded, leaned in, let her run. Green knew the camera angles. She knew exactly how long to pause between sentences so her words could be cut into sound bites, posted, monetized, and cheered. I'm tired of seeing these so-called progressives cry over criminals who don't even belong here. You want tears? Cry for your country. Cry for the people who followed the rules. A quick clip of applause from the studio audience, a fade out to commercial, and that was it. Another performance. Another round of fire and gasoline thrown into the same old echo chamber. And it worked, again. In her Bronx district office, AOC sat across from a flickering screen, her fingers steepled in front of her face. The clip had been forwarded to her 5 times before 10 a.m. She'd resisted watching it. But now that she had, she didn't flinch. She didn't sigh. She just closed the laptop slowly, like sealing a book she'd already memorized. Luis poked his head in. You saw it? I saw it. He waited, unsure whether to ask what he really wanted to ask. But she stood and walked to the window instead. The street below buzzed with weekday noise, honking trucks, school kids crossing in packs, a man wheeling crates of mangoes into the corner store. Life moving forward. Real life. The kind rarely seen on the networks Green catered to. AOC didn't envy her airtime. She didn't even resent it. What she felt, deep in her chest, was something closer to recognition. This was the prelude, the final push before a bigger play. Green was laying the emotional groundwork, firing up the base, framing the next move. You didn't drop lines like sympathy like Halloween candy unless you were preparing to drown compassion in sarcasm. She's baiting, Alexandria said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Trying to pick the fight before we do. Louis stepped in further. They're running that clip on every hour. It's already trending under border betrayal. Alexandria turned to face him. Good. Let it burn fast. They're showing who they are, even without us lighting a match. But inside, she wasn't as calm as she looked. Not because of Green's words, those were predictable, but because of the audience. The clapping, the retweets, the comment sections overflowing with, send them all back, and finally someone said it. It was never just about what Green said. It was about how ready people were to nod along. And yet, she didn't move to respond. Not yet. Because as she'd been taught, and as she was beginning to feel in her bones, there's more power in silence before the strike than in shouting back on cue. She reached for her notebook again, flipped back to the page marked record, and beneath it wrote one new word, pattern. Because this wasn't a moment, it was a habit, and some habits need to be exposed not with noise, but with timing. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed low overhead, casting a soft, uneven glow over the worn linoleum floor. It smelled faintly of crayons, cafeteria pizza, and hand sanitizer, comforting in a way only public spaces can be. AOC had been coming to this center since before she took office, back when she'd organized voter registration drives out of a folding table near the entrance. Now the table had her name on it, though she still preferred to stand. She had just wrapped up a conversation with 2 small business owners about zoning restrictions when she noticed a girl standing nearby, about 10 or 11 years old, wearing a sky blue hoodie 2 sizes too big and hugging a backpack like it might slip away if she let go. The girl didn't speak right away, just watched her, curiously, carefully. AOC crouched down a little, enough to be eye level. Hi there, you okay? The girl's voice was soft but steady. Why do they hate us? The question dropped into the room like a coin in a deep well. Simple, clean, and echoing. AOC didn't ask who they were. She didn't need to. The question had been asked in different forms all week, on calls and letters, in looks from parents who couldn't find the words but hoped she'd find them for them. She looked at the girl for a long moment. Her mind spun through everything she could say, policy, history, political backlash, but none of it felt right. Not here. She placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder and answered honestly, because fear is easier than understanding. The girl blinked. But we didn't do anything. I know, AOC replied, and that's what makes it scarier. For them. The girl didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped just enough to show she'd heard something she could hold on to. Something she might remember later, when the words on the news got too loud again. AOC pulled her in for a hug. It was instinctual, protective. Not the kind of hug meant for cameras or statements, but the kind that came from the part of you that still remembered what it felt like to be small and confused by a world that treated you like a problem. When she let go, the girl didn't say anything else. She just nodded, clutched her backpack, and walked back to the table where her older brother was helping stack chairs. AOC stood still for a beat longer, watching the room as if she could memorize it. The kids playing Uno on a milk crate, the grandmother correcting someone's Spanish spelling homework, the walls lined with handmade posters reading "Know Your Rights" and "Si se puede." 100 pieces of life that people like MTG never seem to understand, or even want to. Louis approached quietly from the side. We've got to head back soon. You've got a policy call in 30. She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. That video, those words, the microphone, the tape, the growing pattern. And now this question, from a girl who hadn't even seen the headlines but had already felt the weight of them. It's time, she said quietly. Luis didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. Because when a child in your district asks why they're hated, and you don't just hear it, but feel it, you don't wait for the right media cycle. You act. And in that moment, in a small building off Tremont Avenue, surrounded by ordinary people holding extraordinary dignity, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made a quiet decision. She wouldn't raise her voice. She would raise the volume on theirs. The next morning, Alexandria's voice was steady, but her eyes didn't blink as she spoke into the phone. Get me back on that committee panel next week. On the other end, her chief of staff paused. You want back in the next judiciary session? Yes. Another pause. This one longer. The kind that says, I know where this is going, but I need to hear you say it anyway. I assume this is about the green audio, he said carefully. AOC glanced at the manila folder on her desk. Inside, transcriptions, timestamps, the raw clip. Not a rumor, not hearsay, just words. Captured, confirmed. I'm not releasing anything yet, she said, but I'm not sitting back either. 10 minutes later, her core staff was in the room. Luis, Sasha, Maribel, and her chief. Everyone had the same look, half caffeinated, half concerned. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. This will draw blood, Sasha said flatly, and they'll say you threw the first punch. She threw the punch, Luis countered. She just thought no one was watching. But they'll spin it, the chief added. They'll accuse you of ambushing her, of playing dirty. You know how they are with hot mics. They'll call it entrapment. AOC tapped her finger against the table once. This isn't entrapment, it's exposure. Maribel folded her arms. Still, if you misplay this, it'll look like a stunt. Cheap. Like you're doing it for headlines, not principle. And if I stay silent, AOC asked calmly but firmly, if I let it sit, let it fade, then I become the one who heard something rotten and looked the other way. The room went quiet. No one doubted her conviction. They just feared the noise it would unleash. She leaned forward, hands clasped. Look, this isn't about a viral moment. I'm not shouting. I'm not editing clips. I'm not adding commentary. I'm playing her words, that's it. Her voice, her tone, her truth. Luis nodded slowly. You want the mic back on? It never turned off, she replied. She just thought it did. The staff exchanged glances, each measuring the risk in their heads like political chess. One move could lead to a checkmate or collapse. But AOC wasn't playing to win a match. She was trying to break the board. Sasha finally spoke. Okay, you want back on that panel? I'll talk to the committee chair. We'll get you on the schedule. Make it quiet, AOC said. No press leaks, no hints. I want the first time people hear it to be when it matters. And what will you say? Her chief asked. I don't know yet, she answered truthfully. But I know when I'll say it. The room slowly emptied after that, one by one. each person leaving with a mental list of tasks and a knot in their stomach. Not from worry, but anticipation. Alexandria remained seated, staring at the folder one more time before slipping it into her briefcase. She didn't need to memorize the audio. It was already etched into her memory. Not just the words, but the ease with which they were said. That ease was the most dangerous part. Before leaving the room, she whispered softly, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to her younger self, or to the girl in the blue hoodie from the community center. They won't expect calm, they won't expect quiet, but that's where truth lives, and I'm going to let it speak. She clicked off the light and walked out. The moment wasn't coming. She was walking toward it. The committee room was more crowded than usual, not just with members and aides, but with cameras, discreetly positioned, yet undeniably present. You could feel it in the posture of the people seated behind the panel, the way they adjusted their ties or tucked strands of hair behind their ears more often than necessary. They weren't just participating in a hearing, they were performing, and MTG was the headliner. She was already mid-sentence when AOC entered, slipping into her seat with the practiced quiet of someone who knew exactly where the rhythm of power paused and when it rose again. Green stood tall, unapologetically animated, her voice rising and falling in sharp, cutting arcs. "This is not an immigration system," she was saying, finger jabbing at the air. "It's a surrender. We have chaos at our borders, lawlessness in our cities, and radicals in this very chamber who think that compassion is more important than law." A few murmurs of agreement echoed behind her. Some scribbled notes. Some just leaned back, letting her rant wash over them like background noise. But AOC didn't move. She kept her hands folded on the desk, chin slightly tilted downward, eyes calm but attentive. "They're crying over criminals," MTG went on, "while mothers in Texas bury their sons. They're worried about so-called asylum seekers when American jobs are disappearing, when cartels walk right through open gates." She shook a stack of papers she hadn't once looked down to read. "This bill doesn't fix the problem. It invites it. And it's not a border crisis. It's a betrayal. One led by people who hate what this country stands for." There it was, the crescendo. Every speech like this had one, a line designed to go viral, to inflame, to slice through nuance and stitch itself onto the evening news ticker. And Green delivered it with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed it in the mirror. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She'd learned long ago that Green wasn't aiming for dialogue. She was aiming for clips, but something about the air in the room had shifted, slightly, like a thread had been pulled somewhere, and was quietly unraveling the fabric. It wasn't just MTG's words. It was the energy behind them, forced, frantic, and strangely premature. As if she sensed something coming and was trying to front-load her fire before the narrative turned. The chair recognized Green's time had expired. She protested naturally, pushing one last, "They don't care about Americans," before finally stepping back. And then, silence. A procedural voice. "Next, the gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes." AOC moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to pull the microphone gently toward her. Her folder rested neatly on the desk, closed. No pages rustled, no binder clip snapped. She didn't need props. She offered a polite nod toward the chair, then glanced, only briefly, toward Green. Not confrontational, not dismissive. Just long enough to say, "I heard you. Now it's time you hear something back." Then she leaned into the mic. But before a single word left her mouth, the room seemed to lean forward. Not physically, but atmospherically. Like the air itself sensed that the temperature was about to change. That after all the shouting, all the posturing, someone was about to do something rare. She wasn't going to argue. She was going to press play, but not yet, not this minute. First came something more dangerous than anger. Clarity. AOC didn't rush. She never did when it mattered. She adjusted the mic gently, her fingers steady, her voice even. Not cold, not hesitant. Measured. Intentional. The kind of tone that carried further than shouting ever could. "Congresswoman Green made several statements last week," she began, not looking at Green, but addressing the entire room. "Some of them on record, some of them not. though she believed they were. That single line hung in the air like a slow-moving current. A few heads turned. Green froze, just slightly. Alexandria didn't blink. She reached into her folder and pressed play on a small recorder placed beside her microphone. The sound that emerged wasn't distorted or muffled. It was clear, unmistakable. Green's voice mid-mutter, casual as a grocery list. Why don't we just ship them back on buses? They're leeches anyway. There was no warning, no introduction, no dressing it up. Just the raw sentence. Just the truth. For a second, it was as if time itself paused. One breath, two. Then came the response. Not from AOC, but from the room. A sharp inhale from a staffer in the back. The low rustle of journalists uncapping pens. Someone in the gallery murmured, "Did she really just say that?" A committee member, one who had previously been half asleep, suddenly sat up straight. Even the chairman's hand stiffened over the desk. AOC didn't fill the silence. She let it settle. And then she continued, voice just as calm as before. That comment, made on a hot mic during the last committee hearing, was not a rhetorical flourish. It was not said to a crowd. It wasn't performance. It was private, or so she assumed. And it reveals something we must confront. Green opened her mouth, but AOC raised a hand. Not rudely, not forcefully. Just enough to say, "You'll have your turn. This is mine." Words like leeches are not accidental, she said. They are intentional dehumanizations. They are used to make it easier to justify cruelty, easier to erase empathy, easier to pretend that policy decisions made in this room are just numbers, not people. She turned a page in her notebook, calmly, then looked directly into the rows of seated colleagues across from her. "I am not playing this to shame a person," she said. "I'm playing it because the American people deserve to know not just what's said on the record, but what's said when someone thinks no one's listening. That is often the closest we ever get to truth in this building." Behind the glass, cameras began to move. Reporters whispered urgently to each other, already texting editors and producers. Green leaned back, arms crossed, the corners of her mouth twitching with the kind of defiance that signaled discomfort beneath the surface. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Maybe she was trying to decide on which defense to choose: denial, spin, or volume. AOC turned her attention back to the panel. "We're not here to debate whether people deserve dignity. That debate was settled a long time ago, by wars, by movements, by sacrifice. But apparently some still need reminding." She paused again, letting the last words hang. "Now they've been reminded." She pressed stop on the recorder, then leaned back in her chair. No shouting, no spectacle, just exposure, pure, unvarnished. And in the space between her words and the committee's stunned silence, one thing had become crystal clear. The mic hadn't just been on. It had been waiting. The stillness in the room didn't last long. It never does when truth crashes into power without knocking. Marjorie Taylor Greene jolted upright, her voice slicing through the stunned quiet. "That's private. You had no right to play that. None." Her words ricocheted through the chamber like an alarm bell. Sharp, defensive, too loud for someone supposedly unfazed. Her face flushed, not in embarrassment, but in rage. Her hands slapped against the table as she leaned forward, ignoring the usual formality of being recognized by the chair. "That was not part of the official hearing," she barked. "That was a side conversation. You can't just—" But AOC didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or lean back. She simply turned her head toward Green, calmly, deliberately, and replied, "What's private about public contempt?" That stopped Green mid-sentence. Not because she didn't have more to say, but because something about the calmness unnerved her more than confrontation would have. Alexandria continued, her voice still steady. "Your microphone was on. You were seated in this chamber in your official capacity, with cameras rolling and the American public watching. You didn't whisper to a friend in a parking lot. You didn't mutter in your kitchen. You said it here, in this building, during a hearing." Green tried again. "It was off the record." "No," AOC replied without missing a beat. "It was off your radar. That's not the same thing." The chairwoman cleared her throat. For a moment, it seemed like order might be called just to break the tension. But instead, she leaned toward the mic and spoke in a calm, judicial tone. The committee recognizes that the audio played was captured during an official hearing. Regardless of the speaker's intent, the material was recorded in the hearing room and will be entered into the record. A silence fell over the room again. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that follows a gavel, a finality, a shift. Green opened her mouth once more, but no one looked at her now. The moment had passed, and she wasn't the one who owned it. AO turned back to her prepared remarks, but she didn't read from them. She let the moment breathe. "We are entrusted with the power to legislate," she said, scanning the room, "but we're also entrusted with something even more delicate, the moral tone of the institutions we serve. We shape not just laws, but how people are allowed to speak about each other. And when the people who hold the microphone speak hate behind the mic, it becomes our duty to hold that mic up for all to hear." Her words were not accusatory, they were instructional, like she wasn't talking to Green anymore, but to the rest of the room, and maybe to those watching beyond the Capitol walls. "I didn't play that clip to shame you," she said quietly. "I played it to remind us all that this building doesn't just echo the loudest voice, it records the quietest cruelty. And whether or not the camera is pointed at you, the people are always listening." There was no applause, no fist pounding, just a silence of reckoning, the kind that trails behind truth when it's delivered plainly. Green didn't respond again. Her posture had changed. No longer aggressive, but bracing. She looked toward her aides, but they avoided her eyes. One of them began typing nervously into his phone, no doubt preparing the first version of damage control. AOC sat back in her chair. She hadn't stormed. She hadn't shouted. She'd simply made sure the American people heard what had already been said. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a hammer, just a button, and the courage to press it. The clip spread faster than any press release could contain. By nightfall, it had already racked up millions of views, reposted by journalists, reshared by activists, dissected by political podcasts. The phrase "send them back," Leeches anyway, was no longer buried in a forgotten C-SPAN feed. It was etched across headlines, threaded into tweets, transcribed on talk shows, and Marjorie Taylor Greene was scrambling. Her first move was familiar: deflection by indignation. Within 12 hours of the hearing, she was seated in front of a friendly backdrop. American flags, warm-toned lighting, and a Fox News chyron that read "MTG responds to outrage machine." Her tone was clipped, somewhere between righteous and rehearsed. "This is a desperate distraction from the real issues," she said, jaw tight, eyes unblinking. "What you're hearing is a manipulated soundbite. It was taken out of context. I was having a private conversation with my staff, and I was referring to the overwhelming strain on our system, not people. But of course, the radical left wants to make it about race, about feelings, because they don't want to talk about facts." The host nodded sympathetically. "Do you think Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez crossed a line?" "She didn't cross a line," Green snapped. "She erased it. She weaponized a technical glitch and turned it into a smear campaign. What kind of precedent does that set? That you can't even talk candidly in your own work environment without someone recording you?" She didn't mention that the microphone hadn't been secretly turned on. It had simply never been turned off. And that detail made all the difference. Her communications team sprang into overdrive, pushing out coordinated tweets and press briefings. They flooded inboxes with talking points. AOC's desperate diversion. Context matters. She's afraid of border policy debate, so she makes it personal. But something strange began happening. The usual right-wing echo chamber that had reliably carried Green's messages began to hesitate. Some pundits played along, parroting the taken-out-of-context narrative. But others, usually eager to defend, went conspicuously quiet. A few prominent conservative commentators raised cautious eyebrows, not because they disagreed with Green's views, but because the recording had been too clean, too unfiltered, too revealing. One host on a mid-market AM radio station admitted on air, "I mean, even if she didn't mean it the way it sounded, let's be honest, it sounded awful." That was the problem. Green had grown accustomed to the comfort of plausible deniability, but the mic hadn't offered her that luxury this time. It hadn't come with edits or spin. It had given people the raw feed. The kind of feed you couldn't scrub with a press release. Behind closed doors, her team argued over tone. Should they escalate? Should she apologize? Should they ignore it altogether and wait for the news cycle to move on? But it wasn't moving on, because AOC wasn't stoking the fire. She wasn't tweeting the clip every hour. She wasn't giving interviews about it. She let the recording speak for itself, and that silence made it harder to fight. Green's staff began floating the idea of a counteroffensive, accusing AOC of violating ethical boundaries. She baited her, one aide said on a conference call. She planned this. It's entrapment. But even internally, no one believed it would stick. The recording wasn't the result of a trap. It was the result of carelessness. And that kind of mistake wasn't easy to reframe. By day 3, the spin had lost momentum. The phrase "leech comment" began trending independently of political hashtags. Late-night shows picked it up. Activists printed it on protest signs. Faith leaders referenced it in Sunday sermons. One veteran congressman from a border state said on camera, "Even if she didn't mean it that way, she said it. And that means something." In AOC's office, no one celebrated. They didn't pass around champagne or tweet smug emojis. Instead, they kept doing the quiet work, answering policy emails, scheduling meetings, preparing for the next vote. Because this wasn't about winning a moment, it was about holding up a mirror. And when the reflection is ugly enough, no amount of spin can unbreak the glass. The clip reached beyond political Twitter. It seeped into church basements and union halls, slipped into living rooms during dinner, made its way into barbershop debates and high school civics classrooms. It wasn't the kind of scandal that vanished after 24 hours. It lingered because it wasn't just a soundbite, it was a reflection, and millions of Americans saw themselves, or the people they loved, in the silence that followed those words. The first video that went viral wasn't from a news anchor or influencer. It was from a retired Army sergeant in Ohio, filming from the front porch of his modest one-story home, an American flag billowing faintly behind him. His voice cracked but never wavered. "We fought for better than this," he said. "Not just in the war, in the decades after. We fought to keep this country honest. I didn't lose friends overseas just to come home and hear a congresswoman talk about shipping people away like livestock. I'm ashamed. For the first time in a long time, I'm ashamed of someone we elected." Tens of thousands shared the video. Veterans reposted it with simple captions. "Agreed. Exactly this. Semper Fi, brother." Another clip came from a classroom in Phoenix, where a young teacher recorded a short message between periods. Her students were mostly second-generation immigrants. Her own parents had crossed the border 2 decades earlier with nothing but a church contact and a prayer. "That wasn't a mistake," she said, voice quiet, eyes fierce. "That was her instinct. That's who she is when no one's watching. And if we let that go unchallenged, we're telling every kid who sounds like my students that they can be erased without consequence." A grandmother in El Paso wrote a letter that went viral after her grandson posted it to Reddit. In it, she recalled standing in line for hours to apply for citizenship, struggling to learn enough English to pass the test, and crying when she finally received her certificate. "They told me I belonged," she wrote. "Now I hear words like leeches, and I wonder if they ever meant it." Clergy began speaking about it too, not as political actors, but as moral ones. A pastor in Georgia preached a sermon titled "What We Say in the Dark," quoting the clip before adding, "Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks." So what kind of heart says things like that when it thinks God's not listening? One of the most unexpected responses came from a Republican mayor in a small town in Iowa. He didn't make a press statement. He didn't hold a conference. He just posted a single tweet. "My wife is an immigrant. My son heard that clip. He asked if he was a leech. I had to explain to him that love doesn't sound like that." There were, of course, those who defended Green, saying the outrage was overblown, that people were too sensitive, that the phrase was just colorful language. But those voices were quieter than expected. The tone had shifted. Even among her usual allies, there was a discomfort they couldn't quite scrub away. Because the clip didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like contempt. And that's what people felt. More than anger, more than sadness. They felt seen, not in the good way, but in the way that happens when someone says what they really think and assumes you're not important enough to care. Back in her district office, AOC scrolled through the responses in silence. She didn't repost most of them. She didn't add commentary. She just read. A teacher in Michigan wrote, "Thank you for letting the country hear it for what it was. It wasn't politics, it was truth." A veteran from South Carolina wrote, "She said it like she's said it 100 times. You didn't expose a moment. You exposed a mindset." And in the margins of her notebook, next to the word record, Alexandria wrote two more words. People heard. Not because she shouted, but because this time, the quiet part wasn't quiet anymore. The envelope arrived folded neatly among a pile of printed emails, briefings, and committee agendas. It was off-white, slightly creased, handwritten in dark blue ink. No return address, just a simple stamp and the words Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, personal. Most handwritten mail got screened and logged by staff, but this one had been set aside and marked with a yellow sticky note. "Thought you'd want to see this one." AOC found it on her desk after a long morning of calls. The hearing was 3 days behind her, but the ripples still hadn't settled. She'd been fielding nonstop questions from reporters, carefully deflecting interviews, and focusing on actual legislation in between the noise. What she hadn't had time for, what she hadn't made time for, was reflection. The emotional kind. The kind that didn't schedule itself into the day. She peeled the envelope open slowly, not expecting much. Just another voice in a long chorus of reactions. But as she read, she stopped breathing for a second. "Dear Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I'm writing this from my kitchen table in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm 82 years old. My hands don't write as smoothly as they used to, so forgive the scratches. I grew up during a time when people said ugly things out loud and expected us not to notice. We were raised to be quiet, to be polite, to believe that dignity meant endurance, even when it hurt. But you didn't shout. You didn't perform. You just let us hear what was always there. And that made all the difference. You reminded me of something my father once said after standing up to someone who called him a half-breed in the Navy. He said, 'I didn't yell. I just opened the window and let the stink out. Thank you for opening the window.' With respect, Mrs. Lila Mendez Alexandria read the letter twice. Then again, slower. She didn't cry, but her throat tightened with that familiar mix of sorrow and gratitude. The kind that reminded her she wasn't just holding paper. She was holding someone else's lived truth. A story folded into someone else's breath. She looked around her office. The bustle had died down. Luis was out. Sasha was on a Zoom call in the next room. No one was watching. So she read the letter again, this time aloud, not loudly, softly, as if reading it back to Lila, wherever she was. "You didn't shout. You just let us hear what was always there." She let the sentence linger in the air. She'd been told so many times, speak louder, fight harder, go bigger. But this woman's words reminded her of the opposite truth, that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you could do was simply not speak over someone else's hate, but press play and step aside. Let the world decide what it heard. AOC reached for the small wooden box she kept in her drawer. She didn't open it often. Inside were only three things: a faded photograph of her father in a Mets cap, a pressed rose from his memorial, and the small journal he used to write in. Notes, quotes, sometimes grocery lists scribbled in the margins of philosophy. She placed Lila's letter next to the journal and closed the box. She didn't need to show it to anyone. It wasn't for display. It was a reminder that the job wasn't always about arguing louder. Sometimes it was about revealing. Not everyone could stomach that kind of clarity. Not everyone welcomed it. But clarity, once exposed, had a habit of sticking. And in a world where microphones turned off and on by the second, where outrage was monetized and apologies manufactured, what mattered most were those rare, quiet moments when the people saw something real. That letter didn't thank her for being clever or combative or dramatic. It thanked her for letting the truth breathe. And as she leaned back in her chair, Alexandria felt something settle in her chest. Not pride, not relief, but resolve. The kind of quiet certainty you carry forward, not for applause, but for the next time someone whispers in a room they think belongs only to them. And the mic hears everything. The recording studio was tucked into the back of a small media collective in D.C., a converted brownstone where the walls were lined with bookshelves, and the producer wore socks instead of shoes to minimize background noise. It wasn't cable news. It wasn't live television. It was quieter here, more deliberate, which suited Alexandria just fine. The host adjusted his mic and gave her a nod from across the table. "Rolling," he said. She nodded back, leaned into the microphone, and waited for the first question. "So," the host began, voice smooth but curious, "you've said almost nothing publicly since the committee hearing. No follow-up press release, no media tour, no campaign ad using the clip. Why?" AOC smiled faintly, the kind that carries more weight than amusement. "Because this wasn't about defeating a colleague," she said. "It was about revealing a pattern." The host tilted his head. "What kind of pattern?" "The one that thrives in silence," she replied. "The pattern where people say things behind closed doors, ugly things, cruel things, and then come out smiling, acting like they're just here for policy. We pretend it's not real because there's no audio, no transcript, but it is real. And this time, we had a moment that made it undeniable." He leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you think she'll change? I mean, now that she's been caught?" AOC didn't answer right away. She looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at him with the same level gaze she'd held in the committee room. "I don't work for her change," she said. "I work for the people's clarity." The host blinked. "That's a quote." "It's also a mission," she continued. "We spend too much time hoping people in power will suddenly grow a conscience. But that's not how accountability works. My job isn't to fix her. It's to make sure folks back home know exactly what's being said in their name, whether it's whispered or shouted." The host adjusted his notes. "You've taken some heat for how you handled it. Some say it was calculated. Some say it was personal." "It was calculated," she admitted, "just not in the way they mean. It was calculated in the sense that I waited. I didn't respond out of anger. I didn't rush to Twitter or call for her resignation. I waited until the setting matched the stakes, until I could say, 'Here's what was said. You decide what it means.'" "Do you feel vindicated?" he asked. Alexandria shook her head. "I don't believe in personal vindication in public work. This isn't reality TV. I'm not here for a clapback reel. If anyone feels seen, I want it to be the people who've heard those same kinds of insults their whole lives, at work, in school, at the doctor's office, and were told to shrug it off." The host was quiet for a moment, then, "You know, it's interesting. You never actually called her a racist." "No," AOC said, "because I didn't need to. She spoke for herself. And frankly, I think part of our problem is that we've turned labels into shields. People get more offended by the accusation than they do by the harm. I'm more interested in describing behavior than debating terminology." He chuckled. "That'll be another quote." She smiled. "Feel free to use it." The episode wrapped 30 minutes later, after they'd covered policy, organizing, and her plans for the fall. No fireworks, no viral moment, just conversation. But as the host walked her out and thanked her again, he paused on the doorstep and said, "That one line, the people's clarity, I think that's going to stick." Alexandria nodded, stepping into the sunlight. "I hope so, because clarity doesn't trend, it lingers. And in a city that feeds on noise, sometimes the most radical thing you can offer people is the quiet truth. Unembellished, undeniable, and impossible to unhear when spoken aloud." The next Judiciary Committee hearing came and went without a trace of Marjorie Taylor Greene. No statement, no explanation. Just an empty seat with her nameplate quietly removed from the table and replaced with a substitute. A newer member, a freshman congressman from a safe district in the Midwest, sat in her place, shuffling papers nervously as he prepared to speak on asylum protocol. No one mentioned her absence directly. No one needed to. In Washington, the loudest things were often left unsaid. AOC arrived 5 minutes early, took her usual seat, and kept her folder closed in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her name wasn't on the speaking schedule that day, but her presence was unmistakable. The moment she entered, conversation softened. Staffers looked up. The camera crew tilted their lenses slightly in her direction, not out of spectacle, but out of a quiet acknowledgement. Something had shifted since the last session. The freshman congressman spoke with practiced restraint, as if someone had briefed him thoroughly on the week prior. He used words like due process and legal channels, steering clear of loaded phrases. His tone was measured, polite, almost cautious. When he paused, his eyes drifted once in AOC's direction, not for validation, but to check the weather of the room. Alexandria nodded once, politely, and returned her gaze to the notes in front of her. It was the kind of moment that didn't make headlines. There was no confrontation, no mic drop, no gavel-pounding drama. But for those paying attention, it was unmistakable. The temperature in the hearing room had cooled, not in apathy, but in awareness. No one wanted to be the next hot mic. AOC listened closely to each speaker. Her pen moved occasionally, jotting quick margins of policy, inconsistencies, or reminders to follow up on data. But more often than not, she simply watched, not with the boredom of disengagement, but with the stillness of someone who had already spoken and no longer needed to fill space to be felt. She'd learned that in rooms like these, power didn't always come from volume. Sometimes it came from memory, from the residue of clarity. Her silence now carried the weight of what she had already revealed. At one point, a Republican representative made a comment about border security overwhelming communities. It wasn't inflammatory, just vague enough to pass. But before the sentence could settle into the usual rhythm of the hearing, there was a noticeable pause. The representative glanced up, almost involuntarily, toward Alexandria's seat. She didn't react. She simply looked back, neutral but present. That was enough, because the room now remembered what happened when things were said, with the assumption that no one was really listening. As the hearing moved forward, the substitute in Green's place continued his remarks. He didn't stumble, but his words lacked the thunder Green had brought. There was no fire, no fury, just carefully managed phrases read from a typed page. He wasn't there to rile anyone. He was there to stabilize. And in some strange way, that was its own kind of reckoning. After the hearing adjourned, members began filing out quietly. AOC remained seated for a few extra moments, letting her notes rest untouched. A young aide from the other side of the aisle passed by, and without prompting, said softly, "That was different today." Alexandria looked up. "Yes," she said, "it was." Then she stood, gathered her things, and left the room. Not with noise or spotlight, but with the quiet authority of someone who had reshaped the tone by letting truth speak louder than she ever needed to. In that hearing room, her legacy wasn't about dominating. It was about defining the silence that followed. She stood at the edge of the hearing room, clutching a leather-bound notebook that was too new to lie flat. Her badge read "Intern" in block letters, just beneath her name, Camilla Reyes. She had arrived 15 minutes early, nervous that being on time wouldn't be enough. It was her first day shadowing the committee staff, and the room felt larger than it looked on C-SPAN. Colder, too, as if the walls still held the tension of past arguments. She walked quietly to the back row, scanning the nameplates as if studying a map. Then her eyes found Ocasio-Cortez. AOC hadn't arrived yet, just the placard in a single folder placed precisely in the center of her seat. Still, that name alone pulled something out of Camilla, like recognition without introduction. She didn't move closer. She didn't take a photo. She just stood still, watching the chair, letting herself imagine what it would feel like to sit there one day and speak without flinching. The gavel had not yet dropped. The room buzzed with small talk and shuffling papers. And somewhere in that soft anticipation, Camilla felt it. Not ambition, but responsibility. Not spotlight, but voice. From the back row, she straightened her shoulders. No one noticed. But that wasn't the point. And in that moment, without fanfare or applause, Alexandria's voice echoed. Not aloud, but in memory, passed from witness to witness. "If they whisper hate, we will speak truth. And if they try to turn off the mic, we will become the sound itself." The hearing would begin in 5 minutes. But something deeper had already started. Not in the chamber. In her. In the next chair. Waiting. The sun was just beginning to stretch over the rooftops of the Bronx as AOC walked past the corner bodega she used to buy tamarind candy from as a kid. The air smelled like warm bread, fruit crates, and sidewalk coffee, a scent that always reminded her of home more than any speech ever could. People didn't rush toward her with cameras or microphones here. They didn't talk to her like she was a headline. They called her mija, asked how her abuela was doing, and offered her fruit without charge, even though she always paid anyway. It was the kind of support that didn't shout. It simply showed up. She passed Mr. Santiago's grocery on 149th, and he was already outside, arranging a crate of avocados like it was an art form. He spotted her and lifted a hand, wiping his brow with a dish towel before saying, "You did good, mija." She paused and smiled, familiar warmth rising in her chest. "Yeah? You didn't scream," he said, nodding toward the newspaper folded under his arm. "You let her scream herself." AOC let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. He didn't ask about the politics. He didn't need the clip explained. He understood the difference between performance and presence. And more than that, he knew what it meant to be from a place where dignity was measured by how little you let them shake your voice. She waved, kept walking. Cars honked. Someone from a window yelled, "Te vimos en la tele!" And she just smiled because this place, these people, knew her long before the headlines. And they didn't need her to win every battle. They just needed her to stand, speak when it counted, and walk home the same way she left. Head high, ears open, heart intact. The video was only 4 minutes long. No studio lights, no dramatic music. Just Alexandria seated at her district desk, Bronx sunlight filtering through the window behind her. No logo, no framing, just one woman speaking directly to a country still processing what it had heard. Her voice was calm, steady, clear. "I've been asked why I didn't shout, why I didn't respond with fire," she began. "But here's the truth. I didn't need to. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let the truth echo in its own voice." Clips rolled quietly across the screen. Congressional chambers, mid-debate. Kids raising their hands in classrooms. Protesters holding handmade signs. Elders praying in folding chairs beside polling places. She continued, "The mic was never off. Not that day. Not in history. It's always on. Even when we think no one's listening, it's on. Recording who we are. Preserving what we tolerate. Echoing what we allow to go unchallenged." A pause not for effect, but for breath, for meaning. The question is not whether we're being heard. The question is, what will it hear from us? What will we say when no one's watching, when it's just us and the conscience we carry? She looked straight into the lens, not challenging, inviting. "I don't ask you to shout. I ask you to speak with honesty, with courage, with love that doesn't flinch. Because every hallway, every chamber, every corner of this country has ears. The mic is always on." And with that, she ended. No slogan, no applause. Just a quiet fade into the footage of a neighborhood basketball court at dusk, where two boys laughed so loud it echoed off the walls. And the mic kept recording. The screen fades to black. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sound creeps back in. It's not music. It's a voice. Familiar now. Raw. Unfiltered. Why don't we just ship them back on buses? They're leeches anyway. Marjorie Taylor Greene's words, clipped from the original recording, play again. Not to sensationalize, but to remind. The audio crackles slightly, as if pulled from the very wire it escaped through. For a moment, there is only that line, hanging in the dark, echoing with everything it means and everything it pretended not to. Then another voice, softer, calmer, measured, AOC, not shouting, not rebutting, just speaking. "Silence can be strategy," she says, her voice layered gently over Greene's. "But truth is thunder when it finally speaks." As she finishes, the darkness begins to lift. Not into bright light, but into moments. Snapshots, the quiet kind. A janitor sweeping the marble hallway of Congress. A teacher erasing a whiteboard in an empty classroom. A girl on a city bus, earbuds in, eyes closed. All of them ordinary. All of them listening. And beneath it all, the mic hums, not loudly but constantly, a thread beneath the noise of daily life. The reminder that what we say, even when we think no one hears, matters. The last image is simple. A single committee desk, empty, still. But the red mic light is on, steady, quiet, unwavering. And the story doesn't end. It simply fades, because the mic is still recording, and someone somewhere is about to speak.